Before you question a man's uniform, you should understand what it took for him to earn it. The morning sun stretched across the private terminal like a sheet of gold, reflecting off the polished aluminum body of a passenger jet waiting quietly on the runway. The air carried the low hum of ground equipment and the distant roar of another aircraft lifting into the sky. Captain Elijah Brooks stepped out of the terminal doors with the calm, measured stride of someone who had repeated this routine hundreds of times. His navy blue pilot uniform was pressed sharp, the silver wings above his chest pocket catching the light every time he moved. A black leather flight bag hung from his hand, worn just enough to show years of early mornings and late landings. In 20 minutes, he would be guiding Flight 247 30,000 feet above the clouds, carrying more than 100 passengers across 3 states. But at that moment, before he could even reach the service gate that led toward the aircraft, a voice cut through the quiet morning like a sudden gust of cold wind. "Hold on a second." The words came from Officer Daniel Mercer, a white airport patrol officer standing beside a cruiser parked near the curb. Mercer's eyes moved slowly over Elijah's uniform, lingering not on the wings, not on the badge stitched with the airline's logo, but on Elijah himself. Travelers nearby paused, sensing the tension that sometimes appears in public spaces without warning. Elijah stopped politely, turning toward the officer with the same calm professionalism he used when speaking to air traffic control. "Good morning, officer," he said evenly. Mercer stepped closer, studying the uniform again, his expression somewhere between suspicion and disbelief. "That's an impressive outfit," Mercer said, his tone carrying a faint edge of mock curiosity. "Mind telling me where you got it?" Elijah blinked once, clearly surprised by the question, but not offended, at least not outwardly. "I'm scheduled to fly Flight 247 this morning," he replied calmly, gesturing toward the aircraft visible beyond the fence line. The jet's nose gleamed in the sunlight, its airline logo unmistakable. Mercer didn't even glance at it. Instead, his gaze hardened. "So you're saying you're the captain of that plane?" he asked, folding his arms slowly. Around them, a few passengers pulling rolling suitcases slowed their steps, pretending to check their phones while quietly watching. Elijah nodded once. "Yes, sir." The officer tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the statement against his own expectations. "Interesting," Mercer muttered. He looked again at the wings pinned neatly above Elijah's pocket, then at the ID badge clipped to the jacket. For a brief second, the morning breeze lifted the edge of Elijah's jacket sleeve, revealing the watch he always wore when flying, an instrument he trusted to the second. Time mattered in aviation. Precision mattered. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter to the man standing in front of him. Mercer let out a small breath through his nose, unconvinced. "Well," he said slowly, "we're going to need to verify that." Elijah remained still, his posture relaxed but dignified, as if he had learned long ago that composure was sometimes the strongest response. A ground crew cart rolled past behind them, its driver glancing curiously at the scene. Overhead, the airport loudspeaker crackled softly as the boarding team inside the terminal began preparing announcements for the morning departures. Elijah looked briefly toward the jet again, then back at the officer. "Officer," he said quietly, "you might want to double-check the flight manifest before this goes any further." Mercer's eyebrows lifted slightly, almost amused. Around them, the quiet attention of strangers continued to grow. And none of them, not the passengers, not the crew members walking across the tarmac, not even the officer standing there, had any idea that within the next few minutes, the simple question about a uniform was about to become something much bigger than anyone expected. Officer Daniel Mercer did not move right away, but the air between the two men shifted in a way that everyone nearby could feel. The morning that had started calm and ordinary now carried a strange tension, the kind that makes people slow their steps without realizing why. Mercer glanced briefly toward the aircraft sitting beyond the fence, its engines silent, its nose pointed toward the bright runway stretching more than 8,000 feet into the distance. Then his attention returned to Elijah Brooks. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were examining a puzzle that refused to fit the picture in his mind. "The manifest," Mercer repeated slowly, almost tasting the word. "That is what you want me to check." Elijah stood exactly where he had stopped moments earlier, shoulders relaxed, voice steady. "Yes, sir," he answered. It will confirm who is scheduled to fly that aircraft this morning. Mercer gave a short, quiet laugh that carried more disbelief than humor. You seem very confident, he said. Around them, the quiet curiosity of strangers had grown. A couple walking toward the terminal slowed to a stop near a luggage cart. A baggage handler pushing a row of suitcases paused for a moment, pretending to adjust the handle while watching the exchange. Airports were places where uniforms usually settled questions quickly. But today the uniform itself seemed to be the question. Elijah remained calm, the way he had learned to be in training when alarms sounded unexpectedly in the cockpit simulator. Panic never solved anything at 30,000 feet, and it did not solve anything on the ground either. The sunlight continued to catch the silver wings on his chest, reflecting small flashes of light each time he shifted slightly in the breeze. Mercer stepped closer, studying the badge clipped to Elijah's jacket. The identification card displayed the airline name, the employee photograph, and a barcode used by the crew gates throughout the airport. The officer tilted his head again, still unconvinced. Anyone can print a badge these days, he said. Uniforms too. Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the statement without arguing. That is why the manifest exists, he replied. The calmness in his voice made the conversation feel strangely unbalanced. Mercer seemed to expect irritation or defensiveness, but neither appeared. Instead, Elijah spoke with the same tone he used during pre-flight briefings with his crew. Nearby, the airport loudspeaker crackled again, and a distant voice announced boarding preparations for several departing flights. A faint breeze carried the smell of jet fuel across the tarmac. Mercer rested one hand on the roof of his patrol car, thinking. He had worked airport security long enough to trust his instincts. And at that moment his instincts insisted something about the scene did not look right. Yet the confidence of the man standing before him made the situation less certain than he expected. Let me ask you something, Mercer said finally. If you are truly the captain of that aircraft, why are you walking out here alone? Elijah lifted his flight bag slightly. Because the rest of the crew is finishing their checks inside the terminal, he answered. I prefer to arrive early and review the aircraft from the outside before boarding begins. Mercer looked toward the jet again. Its polished surface reflected the blue sky, and ground technicians were beginning to move equipment into position for departure. The officer folded his arms slowly, considering the explanation. The passengers nearby continued pretending not to watch, but the silence around them had grown thick with anticipation. Elijah noticed the time on his watch. Boarding would begin soon. He met Mercer's eyes again, still calm, still patient. Officer, he said carefully, I understand that you are doing your job. But if you verify the crew list for Flight 247, you will find my name exactly where it should be. Mercer said nothing for several seconds. Then he reached toward the radio clipped to his shoulder, his expression tightening as he prepared to confirm the information. Neither man realized yet that the next response over that radio was about to change the entire situation. The radio on Officer Daniel Mercer's shoulder crackled softly as he pressed the button, and the quiet static seemed louder than the distant rumble of aircraft engines warming on the far runway. Dispatch, this is Mercer at the East Service Gate, he said clearly. I need verification on the crew manifest for Flight 247. The words drifted through the warm morning air, while the people nearby pretended to stay focused on their own business. Elijah Brooks remained still, his posture composed, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his worn flight bag. He had learned long ago that patience could carry a person through moments when emotions might otherwise take control. The sunlight climbed higher across the sky, reflecting off the polished metal of the aircraft waiting beyond the fence, the jet that Elijah had prepared himself to fly within the next half hour. Mercer listened to the radio, waiting. The seconds stretched longer than they should have. A ground technician drove past in a small electric cart, slowing slightly as curiosity pulled his eyes toward the quiet standoff near the patrol car. Finally, the radio answered with a calm voice from airport operations. Copy that, Officer Mercer. Stand by while we access the flight roster. Mercer glanced at Elijah again, his expression unreadable. The officer seemed determined to maintain control of the moment, yet something about the pilot's calm confidence made the situation less certain than he expected. Elijah's eyes briefly moved toward the aircraft again. The plane stood tall against the bright sky, its wings stretching wide like a promise waiting to be kept. Years of training had taught him that every departure began with discipline and focus, not with distraction. Yet here he was, delayed on the ground by a question that should have been simple to answer. The radio crackled again. "Officer Mercer, the manifest for Flight 247 is loading now." Mercer shifted his weight slightly and rested his hand against the roof of the patrol car. Around them, more travelers had begun drifting closer to the curb outside the terminal doors. Some stood quietly with coffee cups in their hands. Others paused with rolling suitcases beside them, all sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Elijah could feel the attention without turning his head. The silver wings pinned to his chest caught the light again, bright and unmistakable. Those wings had taken him nearly 15 years to earn, from small training aircraft to commercial jets crossing state lines at 30,000 feet. They represented discipline, responsibility, and thousands of hours of trust placed in his hands. Yet at that moment they were being questioned by someone who had not yet checked the simplest record. Mercer's radio spoke again. "Officer Mercer, the system confirms the scheduled captain for Flight 247. The dispatcher paused briefly, the sound of typing faint in the background. Mercer straightened slightly, as if preparing for the answer. Elijah said nothing. He simply watched the officer's face with the quiet patience of a man who understood exactly what the truth would reveal. The dispatcher's voice returned, calm and clear through the speaker. "The listed captain for that aircraft this morning is Captain Elijah Brooks." For a brief moment the morning seemed to freeze. The breeze slowed. The distant sounds of airport traffic faded into the background. Several of the travelers nearby exchanged quick glances, their curiosity now turning into realization. Mercer did not respond immediately. His eyes moved slowly from the radio on his shoulder to the man standing in front of him. The calm figure in the Navy uniform had not moved an inch. Elijah's voice came quietly, steady as ever. "Like I said, officer," he explained without any trace of anger. "You might want to verify the details before making assumptions." The silence that followed carried a weight that no one standing there could ignore, because in that moment the simple question about a uniform had turned into something far more serious than anyone expected. Officer Daniel Mercer stood still for a moment after the radio confirmation, the dispatcher's words still echoing faintly from the speaker on his shoulder. "Captain Elijah Brooks." The name had come through clearly, without hesitation, carried across the quiet air like a fact that refused to be ignored. The people standing nearby had heard it too. A man holding a boarding pass lowered his coffee cup slightly. A woman with a rolling suitcase paused mid-step, her eyes moving between the officer and the pilot. The morning had suddenly grown heavier with attention. Mercer shifted his stance and looked again at the uniform in front of him. The Navy jacket, the silver wings, the identification badge, all of it now matched the information coming through the radio. Yet something in his posture suggested he was not ready to let the moment end so easily. Pride can be stubborn when it feels challenged in front of strangers. Mercer cleared his throat quietly and reached toward Elijah's badge again, studying the photograph more carefully. The image showed the same calm face standing in front of him now, the same steady eyes, the same name printed in bold letters beneath the airline logo. Elijah did not move while the officer examined it. Years of aviation had trained him to remain composed in situations that demanded control. When an aircraft encountered sudden turbulence at 30,000 feet, the captain did not react with panic. The captain steadied the aircraft and focused on the instruments. That same discipline lived quietly in Elijah's posture now. Beyond the fence, the aircraft waited patiently on the ramp. A maintenance technician climbed down from a ladder near the nose of the jet and glanced toward the scene unfolding near the service gate. Overhead, the loudspeaker inside the terminal began announcing boarding preparations for the morning flights. The voice was distant but clear. Flight 247 would begin boarding soon. Mercer heard the announcement as well. His jaw tightened slightly. If the man standing in front of him truly was the captain scheduled to fly that aircraft, then every minute of delay mattered. But instead of stepping back, Mercer crossed his arms again and looked directly at Elijah. "Radio confirmations can be wrong," he said slowly. "Systems make mistakes." The statement hung in the air longer than it needed to. Several people nearby exchanged quiet glances, sensing the conversation was moving in a direction that no longer made sense. Elijah did not respond right away. He simply looked at the officer with the same calm expression he had maintained since the beginning. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Officer, there are several ways to confirm the crew list. The airline operations desk inside the terminal can verify it. The gate agents can verify it. Even the crew waiting inside that building can verify it." Elijah nodded gently toward the terminal doors behind them, where the morning sunlight reflected across the glass. Through the windows, silhouettes of airline staff moved quickly between counters and boarding lanes. Mercer followed Elijah's gaze for a moment, but said nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. A distant jet engine began to spool up somewhere across the field, its low vibration rolling across the runway like distant thunder. Elijah glanced briefly at his watch. Time continued moving forward, whether the conversation ended or not. Boarding would begin soon, and a full cabin of passengers would be expecting their captain. He looked back at Mercer and spoke again, still calm, still respectful. "Officer Mercer," he said quietly, "the easiest way to settle this is to walk inside and speak with the gate supervisor." Mercer remained where he was, the morning sun casting a sharp shadow across the pavement beside the patrol car. For a moment it seemed like he might agree, but the look on his face suggested something else entirely. Because even with the confirmation already spoken over the radio, the officer did not appear ready to accept the truth just yet. Officer Daniel Mercer kept his arms folded as the silence stretched between them, and the quiet crowd near the curb felt the tension settle like a heavy cloud over the service gate. The confirmation from the radio had already been spoken, clear and unmistakable, yet Mercer's posture suggested he was not ready to step away. Sometimes pride moves slower than facts. Captain Elijah Brooks stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, his Navy uniform steady in the bright morning light, the silver wings above his pocket reflecting small flashes each time the breeze shifted. He had experienced long delays before. Weather could hold an aircraft on the ground for hours. Air traffic control could reroute an entire flight path across 3 states. But delays caused by misunderstanding were something entirely different. Mercer glanced once more toward the aircraft beyond the fence. The jet stood ready, its wide wings cutting across the sky like a quiet promise. Ground crew members were now moving more quickly around the plane, positioning equipment and preparing the stairs that passengers would soon climb. The boarding announcement had already been made inside the terminal, and time was no longer something that could be ignored. Still, Mercer did not move toward the terminal doors the way Elijah had suggested. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side and studied the pilot again from head to toe. His eyes moved over the polished shoes, the crisp uniform, the wings, the badge. As if searching for something that would confirm the doubt he seemed determined to hold on to. "You seem very calm about all this," Mercer said finally. His voice carried a tone that was neither friendly nor openly hostile, but something closer to disbelief. Elijah answered without hesitation. "Calm is part of the job," he said. "Passengers trust the person in the cockpit to stay steady, even when things become complicated." The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet authority that several people nearby seemed to notice immediately. A man standing near the luggage cart nodded slightly to himself, as if the explanation made perfect sense. Mercer noticed the reactions too. For a moment his gaze moved across the small group of travelers who had gathered within earshot. Their curiosity had turned into quiet observation. Every word spoken now had witnesses. The officer shifted his weight again and placed one hand on the roof of his patrol car. "I am not convinced yet," he said slowly. "Uniforms can be borrowed. Identification cards can be copied." The statement drew a faint murmur from somewhere behind the crowd. Elijah did not react to the comment. Instead, he reached calmly into the side pocket of his flight bag and removed a thin folder. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the same kind of controlled motion used when opening a checklist inside a cockpit. He opened the folder and held it where Mercer could see it. Inside were printed documents, the official flight briefing, weather reports for the route ahead, and the crew's schedule issued by the Airline Operations Center early that morning. Elijah did not push the papers forward. He simply held them at chest level, allowing the officer to read the name printed at the top of the briefing page. Captain Elijah Brooks. Flight 247. Departure time, 9:15 in the morning. Mercer looked down at the page, but did not reach for it. The sunlight reflected off the white paper, making the black letters sharp and impossible to ignore. Around them, the quiet crowd leaned slightly closer without stepping forward. The moment had become strangely still, like the pause before an aircraft accelerates down the runway. Elijah closed the folder again and returned it to his bag. His voice remained calm when he spoke next. "Officer Mercer," he said evenly, "every document you need is already available." The radio confirmed the crew list. The airline can confirm it. The gate agents inside that terminal can confirm it. He glanced briefly toward the aircraft again, then back at the officer. But the passengers waiting for Flight 247 cannot board until their captain walks through that gate. The statement settled into the air with quiet weight. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time since the conversation began, uncertainty flickered across his face. Because the longer the delay continued, the more obvious the situation was becoming to everyone watching. The morning sunlight climbed higher over the terminal as the quiet standoff continued, and the longer the moment stretched, the more obvious it became that the situation had drawn attention far beyond the small group standing near the service gate. Inside the glass walls of the terminal, gate agents moved quickly between counters, scanning boarding passes and preparing announcements. Through the windows, a few of them had begun to glance outside, their attention pulled toward the unusual delay unfolding only a few yards from the entrance. Captain Elijah Brooks stood with the same calm composure he had held from the beginning, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his flight bag. Years of aviation had trained him to measure time carefully, and right now every minute carried weight. In less than 20 minutes, the aircraft behind the fence was scheduled to begin boarding more than 100 passengers who expected a smooth and routine departure. The jet waited quietly in the bright light, its polished body reflecting the blue sky and the slow movement of ground crews preparing the stairs. A mechanic near the nose of the aircraft paused and looked toward the gate, clearly noticing that the captain, who should have been walking toward the plane, was still standing outside the terminal. Officer Daniel Mercer followed Elijah's brief glance toward the aircraft and then back again. The radio confirmation had already spoken the truth. The documents in Elijah's bag had shown the same name, yet Mercer still seemed reluctant to step aside. Pride has a way of holding on to doubt, even when the evidence is clear. The officer shifted his stance beside the patrol car and spoke again, his voice lower now, but still firm. "You have a lot of paperwork," he said slowly. "But procedures exist for a reason." Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the statement without argument. "That is correct," he replied calmly. "Procedures protect everyone involved." A quiet breeze passed across the pavement, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and the distant roar of another aircraft lifting into the sky somewhere beyond the runway. The travelers gathered nearby had grown completely silent, their curiosity now mixed with something else. They could see the uniform. They had heard the radio confirmation. The situation no longer looked like a simple misunderstanding. Mercer noticed their attention and straightened slightly, as if the presence of witnesses had made the moment heavier. He reached toward the radio on his shoulder again, pressing the button once more. "Dispatch," he said, his voice tighter than before. "Confirm the captain listed for Flight 247 one more time." The radio crackled softly as the signal carried across the airport network. Elijah remained still, his eyes calm, his posture unchanged. He had no reason to repeat himself. The truth had already been spoken. Seconds passed before the dispatcher's voice returned, steady and professional. "Officer Mercer, confirmation remains the same. The scheduled captain is Elijah Brooks. Airline operations has also verified the information." Several people in the small crowd exchanged glances again. The answer had come twice now, each time with the same clarity. Mercer lowered his hand slowly from the radio, his eyes returning to the man standing in front of him. The silver wings on Elijah's uniform caught the sunlight again, bright against the navy fabric. For a moment the officer said nothing. The quiet between them felt heavier than before. Finally Elijah spoke. Again, his voice respectful but firm, the same tone a captain uses when guiding a flight crew through a checklist. "Officer Mercer," he said evenly, "boarding for that aircraft will begin shortly. The passengers are waiting inside the terminal. The crew is waiting for their captain." He paused briefly, letting the words settle before finishing the thought. "And right now the only thing preventing that flight from moving forward is this conversation." The statement landed with quiet force. The officer's expression tightened, And for the first time since the exchange began, the confidence in his posture seemed to shift slightly. Because the longer the situation continued, the more obvious it became to everyone standing there that the truth had already been confirmed. The quiet outside the terminal had grown thick with attention, the kind that settles over a place when people sense that something important is unfolding in front of them. Captain Elijah Brooks remained calm, standing tall in his Navy uniform, while the bright morning sun reflected off the silver wings above his pocket. The aircraft beyond the fence still waited patiently, its engines silent, its departure time drawing closer with every passing minute. Inside the terminal, boarding preparations had clearly begun. Through the glass windows, gate agents could be seen moving with purpose, organizing lines of passengers who were beginning to gather with boarding passes in their hands. A few of them now looked outside more openly, their curiosity no longer hidden. Officer Daniel Mercer stood beside his patrol car with his radio still in his hand, the second confirmation from dispatch lingering in the air like a statement that could not be undone. Captain Elijah Brooks. The name had now been verified not once but twice, and even airline operations had confirmed it. Yet Mercer's silence suggested the realization was only beginning to settle in. The officer's gaze drifted again toward the aircraft. Ground crew members had already positioned the mobile stairs beside the jet. A baggage loader rolled several carts toward the cargo hold, while another technician walked slowly around the landing gear, finishing a final inspection. Every movement near the plane carried the quiet rhythm of routine departure. The only thing missing was the captain walking across the ramp. Mercer looked back at Elijah again, studying him carefully as if seeing him for the first time. The calm expression, the steady posture, the quiet confidence that had never once turned into anger. Around them, the small group of travelers continued to watch in silence. Their presence had become impossible to ignore. Finally Mercer spoke again, but this time his voice had changed. The certainty that had filled it earlier had faded, replaced by something more cautious. "You said your crew is inside the terminal," he said slowly. Elijah nodded. "Yes," he answered. "They are preparing for boarding." Mercer glanced toward the terminal doors, where several airline staff members had now stepped closer to the windows, clearly aware that their captain was still outside. One of them appeared to recognize Elijah immediately. The woman leaned toward another employee and pointed toward the service gate. Within seconds the two of them were speaking quickly while looking outside. Mercer noticed the exchange through the glass. His eyes narrowed slightly as the weight of the moment finally began to shift. The confirmation from dispatch had been clear. The documents Elijah carried had matched the same information. And now the airline staff themselves were reacting to the delay. The officer slowly lowered his radio from his shoulder. For the first time since the conversation began, his posture changed in a way that suggested the certainty he had started with was no longer holding steady. Elijah remained calm, saying nothing, allowing the silence to do the work that words no longer needed to do. A few seconds later the terminal doors slid open. Two airline employees stepped quickly onto the sidewalk, scanning the area until their eyes landed on Elijah Brooks standing beside the patrol car. One of them raised her voice immediately. "Captain Brooks," she called out across the short distance, her tone filled with relief and urgency at the same time. The sound of his name carried clearly across the quiet curbside space. Several people in the small crowd turned their heads toward the employees. Mercer followed their gaze. The woman approached quickly, holding a clipboard against her side as she walked. Her eyes moved briefly toward the officer before returning to Elijah. "Captain Brooks," she repeated, slightly out of breath now that she had reached them. "Boarding for Flight 247 is about to begin. The passengers are already gathering at the gate." She paused for a moment, glancing between the two men, clearly confused by the situation she had just stepped into. Mercer looked at her, then slowly back at Elijah. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by witnesses and confirmation from every direction, the truth that had been questioned for so long now stood plainly in front of him. The airline employee stopped only a few feet from Captain Elijah Brooks, her clipboard still pressed against her side as she tried to understand what she had just walked into. The quiet curbside area had now turned into a moment of open attention. Several passengers stood frozen near the terminal entrance, their eyes moving between the uniformed pilot and the patrol officer beside the cruiser. The aircraft behind the fence continued to wait on the ramp, its polished body shining in the late morning light as ground crew members finished their final checks. The woman spoke again, her voice steady but clearly concerned. "Captain Brooks, the gate team is ready. Boarding for Flight 247 will begin in just a few minutes." Her eyes then shifted briefly toward Officer Daniel Mercer, confusion crossing her face. "Is there a problem here?" Mercer did not answer immediately. The weight of the moment had changed the energy around him. The radio confirmation from dispatch had already spoken. The flight documents Elijah carried had shown the same name. Now an airline employee stood in front of them calling the pilot by his title without hesitation. Every piece of information pointed in the same direction. Mercer slowly lowered his arms from their folded position and glanced once more at Elijah's uniform. The silver wings caught the sunlight again, bright and unmistakable. For a brief second the officer seemed to search for something to say, but the words did not come easily. Elijah remained calm, exactly as he had been since the beginning. His voice carried the same measured tone when he finally spoke. "I believe the crew is waiting," he said quietly. The airline employee nodded quickly. "Yes, Captain. The passengers are already forming a line at the gate." Her eyes moved again toward Mercer, still puzzled. "We were wondering why the captain had not come through security yet." The small crowd nearby had grown silent. Even the faint noise of airport activity seemed to fade behind the tension of the moment. Mercer looked from the employee back to Elijah Brooks, and for the first time since the conversation began his posture softened slightly. The certainty that had filled his voice earlier had disappeared. In its place was the uncomfortable awareness that the situation had been allowed to go far longer than it should have. A faint breeze moved across the pavement, lifting the edge of Elijah's jacket sleeve for a moment before it settled again. The watch on his wrist reflected the sunlight. Time continued to move forward. The officer cleared his throat quietly and stepped back half a pace from the patrol car. The movement was small, but everyone watching noticed it. Mercer's voice came out lower now, stripped of the earlier suspicion. "Captain Brooks," he said slowly, acknowledging the title for the first time. The airline employee looked between them again, her expression still uncertain. Mercer glanced briefly toward the aircraft waiting on the ramp and then back at Elijah. The delay had already been witnessed by several people, and it had already been confirmed by dispatch and airline operations. The truth now stood plainly in front of him with nowhere left to hide. Elijah adjusted his grip on the handle of his flight bag and looked calmly toward the terminal doors where the passengers for his flight were gathering. He had not raised his voice once. He had not argued. He had simply allowed the facts to appear one by one. The officer drew a slow breath, and the quiet realization of what had happened seemed to settle heavily into the morning air around them. Officer Daniel Mercer stood in silence for a long moment after speaking Elijah's title, the words Captain Brooks hanging in the air with a weight that everyone present could feel. The small group of travelers near the terminal entrance watched quietly, their curiosity now replaced by a clear understanding of what had unfolded. The airline employee shifted her stance slightly, still holding the clipboard against her side, her attention moving between the officer and the pilot as the situation settled into its final shape. Beyond the fence, the aircraft remained ready for departure, its long wings stretching across the morning sky, while the ground crew finished the last routine checks that happened before every flight. The mobile stairs had already been positioned beside the cabin door, and a baggage cart rolled slowly toward the cargo hold as technicians prepared the aircraft for boarding. Everything about the scene near the plane suggested that the day's journey was ready to begin. The only missing piece had been the captain walking toward the gate. Elijah Brooks stood calmly, his flight bag resting against his leg, the silver wings on his uniform catching the sunlight as the breeze passed across the pavement. For him, the moment was no longer about proving anything. The confirmation had already come from dispatch, from airline operations, and now from the airline staff themselves. The truth had revealed itself without raised voices or anger. Mercer finally stepped slightly away from the patrol car, his posture no longer rigid with doubt. The shift was subtle but clear. He looked once more at Elijah's uniform, then toward the aircraft waiting on the ramp, and then back at the pilot standing in front of him. His voice came out quieter this time. "Captain Brooks," he said again, this time without hesitation. The airline employee nodded politely, as if acknowledging that the conversation had finally reached the understanding it should have reached from the beginning. Elijah met Mercer's gaze for a moment. His expression remained steady and composed, the same calm presence that passengers would later trust while flying thousands of feet above the ground. "I have a flight to prepare," Elijah said gently. The statement was simple, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly where he needed to be. Mercer gave a small nod, stepping aside to clear the path toward the terminal entrance. No one spoke as Elijah lifted his flight bag and began walking toward the glass doors. The travelers standing nearby moved slightly to give him space, some watching with quiet respect as he passed. The airline employee followed a step behind him, already speaking softly about the boarding process that was beginning inside. When Elijah reached the doors, they slid open with a soft mechanical sound, revealing the busy interior of the terminal where passengers waited at the gate. A few people inside recognized the captain immediately and straightened in quiet relief. Elijah walked calmly through the terminal, past the lines of travelers and toward the gate where Flight 247 would soon begin boarding. Outside, Officer Mercer remained beside his patrol car, watching the pilot disappear into the terminal. The bright morning sun continued to reflect off the aircraft waiting on the ramp, and within minutes the captain, who had been questioned outside, would be seated in the cockpit, guiding more than 100 passengers safely across the sky. The runway stretched wide and open beyond the airport buildings, and as the day moved forward, the quiet lesson of the morning lingered in the air long after the aircraft lifted into the clouds.